A very warm welcome to you all from the Commonwealth Foundation. I am very happy to be introducing this Commonwealth Writers Conversation, which focuses on Mark Gevisser's new book, The Pink Line, The World's Queer Frontiers. We are joined by Mark himself, along with writers and activists Kevin Mwachiro, Nickita Maesela, and Xeenarh Mohammed, to discuss the themes of progress and repression that lie at the heart of this book. The Commonwealth Foundation believes strongly in the power of personal stories, the power to connect, to inspire, to transform. Much of what we do, from these writers' conversations to our short story prize, is aimed at amplifying the voices of those who are too often silenced or unheard. It is our great pleasure to take that commitment forward by hosting this important discussion. The conversation itself was pre-recorded, but it is followed by a live Q&A, where you will have the opportunity to ask the panel your own questions. The moderator of this event is Kevin Mwachiro, journalist, podcaster, and queer activist. His writings includes the book Invisible Stories from Kenya's Queer Community, a play entitled Trashed, and poems which are published in the Pan-African Queer Anthology, Walking the Tightrope. His most recent work is short story Number Sita, published in the anthology Nairobi Noir. He is also co-founder of the Art Film Festival, the first LGBTQI film festival in East Africa. Thank you for your participation, and I hope you enjoy this event. Thank you and welcome.
As we say here in Kenya, karibu, which is welcome in Kiswahili. Welcome to all of you. Joining me on the panel, besides Mark, is Nickita Maesela from South Africa. Nickita is a freelance journalist. Her work highlights stories of queer activism and events in Southern Africa, the intersections of faith, gender, and sexuality, and also focuses on people who use art in healing in a world that restricts their freedom. Nickita, thank you very much for joining us. Nickita, who's your African queer icon?
Well, just as you mentioned in the last sentence of my bio, I would have to say Thandi Swamazwai. She's a musician, a conduit, a healer, and queer and iconic. I'm sure a lot of us know who she is or have heard her music. And yeah, she's definitely one of my icons.
Thank you very much for that. From Nickita, we go west, as they say, to Xeenarh Mohammed, who is the executive director of TEARS, the Initiative of Equality Rights. Xeenarh is a lawyer, activist, community organizer, and holistic security trainer, and who has worked in the human rights field both within and outside of Nigeria for over 10 years. Welcome, Xeenarh. Who's your queer icon?
So I think my first African icon is an activist who is here based in Nigeria, Akudo Ugwamba. Akudo is somebody who takes up space and who insists that queer people do not need to apologize for their presence, for their activism, or their humanities. She does not believe in asking for permission. So she's such a good queer icon, not just for me, but a lot of young queers. And then also I am just like a really, really, really big fan of the people whose shoulders that we stand on here in Nigeria. Bisi Alimi, for being able to be who he is, being able to do what he did and what he continues to do. So those are my two queer icons here.
Fantastic. I know BC personally, and good choice there as well, apart from Akudo. And last but not least is Mark Gevisser, author of The Pink Line and the award-winning book, A Legacy of Liberation, Thabo Mbeki, and the Future of South Africa's Dream, Lost, and also a memoir, Lost and Found in Johannesburg. Mark, it was really cool to find out that you were one of the organizers of the first Pride March in in South Africa in 1990. Yeah, and thanks for doing that. Who's your African queer icon, Mark?
Kevin, hi. I would love to say Freddie Mercury, since he was born in Zanzibar, and Queen was such an important part of my growing up and finding my own queerness. But more seriously, I think I would choose Simon Nkodi, who was the South African political prisoner, apartheid activist, freedom fighter, who came out during a treason trial in the 1980s. Came out as gay, therefore introducing the discourse of gay rights into the liberation movements, and who was the founder of the organization that held that first Pride March in Johannesburg in 1990, GLOW. And I really learnt my queer African liberationist politics from Simon. So he would be my choice. You're not going to get away with it. Who's yours?
You stolen mine. It was actually Simon Nkoli as well. And just really admire. I was blown away when I found out about him. You know, I actually have, here in Kenya, we call them lesos, a wrapper with his picture on it, and it actually hangs in my room. And it is for that, his activism and as a queer man, and at that time for me, it speaks volumes. So yeah, let's share Simon, you know. Thank you all for that. And Mark, we'll just go straight into it. Tell us a little bit about your latest book, The Pink Line.
Thank you, Kevin. The idea for the book came to me in a decade ago, in 2010. South Africa, as most people know, is one of the first countries in the world to permit same-sex marriage, and very famously was the first constitution in the world to explicitly outlaw discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And in 2009, my partner and I got married, not because we believe in the institution of marriage, we actually don't, but because it was going to serve us very well. Which is, I think, the reason why many people get married. It would enable me to get spousal benefits on his new job and move with him to Paris. As a consequence of this extraordinary movement forward, progress in South African human rights. Now, a few months after we got married, I read in a newspaper about another couple in the country of Malawi, just to the north of South Africa, who'd taken a similar step to get married publicly, even though homosexuality is illegal in Malawi. This is Tiwonge Chimbalanga and Stephen Monjeza. And the result of their public engagement ceremony was that they were arrested, sensationalized in terrible media all over Malawi's newspapers, sentenced to 14 years hard labor in jail for just announcing publicly their love to each other. Later, Tiwonge, they were released as a consequence of a global clemency campaign and a pardon, and Tiwonge came into exile in South Africa, where she received refugee status on the basis of her gender identity, because it turns out she's a transgender woman. And I began thinking about, you know, what my marriage brought me and what Tiwonge's marriage brought her. And the phrase came into my mind that there's a pink line, which is a new global human rights frontier that is describing and defining and dividing the world in a whole new way in the 21st century, in ways that certainly were unimaginable to a person my age, in my mid-50s, when I was coming out in the 1980s and loving Freddie Mercury. And I wanted to understand this pink line, how it's come about in our world, how it's coming to describe a new global culture wars, what it means to live along this pink line, what it means to putatively cross this pink line, the way Tiwonge did when she left Malawi, where she lived under real threat for her life, and came to South Africa, where allegedly she was going to be safe. the truth, of course, is a lot more complicated, and we can talk about that. So I began to think about this pink line that divides countries in the world, but that runs through countries, because as Nickita, my compatriot, I'm sure will tell you, even though we have this amazing law in South Africa, the reality on the ground is still very tough when it comes to gender-based violence and the way this violence is inflicted on queer people too. So the pink line doesn't only run between countries, it runs through countries. It runs through families, it runs through churches. I think in the world we're living in now, very importantly, and very important for Africa too, it runs between the kind of online freedom and connection you can have if you just have one of these and a little bit of data and some privacy, and the offline strictures that there are when you look up from your screen, and where you've sort of been happily queer on your screen, connecting with this new global identity, and you look into the eyes of a stern parent, or that's going to maybe beat you, or a church that says you're a sinner, or a state that says what you're doing illegal. That's a pink line between that kind of online identity and offline realities, particularly in our African contexts. And I was really interested in this book about what it means to live on that pink line and to have to toggle between those identities, because I think that queer people, and particularly queer Africans, kind of live in two time zones. On the one hand, there's the kind of global liberatory time zone, which is kind of a fast forward. The earth is moving so quickly, and we can jump onto this onto the digital revolution, and there's another time zone in which things are moving really slowly, in which there's kind of generational change that needs to happen for social norms and even laws to change. So that's what the book's about, and the way I explore this in the book is rather than just having all these big ideas, which I think are important, I try and understand these big ideas through people whom I follow. So as you mentioned in your introduction, one of the people I follow is one of the first person I follow is Tiwonge Chimbalanga. She's the first person I met and the first person I write about. Another person I follow is a young man named Michael Bashaija, who was a Ugandan refugee who first fled to Kenya and is now living in Canada. And from there I go all over the world. I have a third African story, which is a really wonderful story about a lesbian couple in Cairo who opened a sidewalk cafe during the Arab Spring, the Tahrir Square revolution. And I have stories from India, from Russia, from Israel and Palestine, from Mexico, from the United States as well.
Just a follow up from that, Mark. Having other stories outside of the continent in the book Pink Line, when you did come back to Africa and experience this is the home of your sexuality, what were your thoughts on your reflections looking at sexuality and then coming back home? And does that make sense?
Yeah, it's sexuality and a gender identity. I mean, I suppose I could say several things. The first is that in Africa, as all over the world, there is an awkward dance between legal reform and social change. And we need to understand that. And it's an awkward dance, 2 steps forward, 1 back, 1 to the side, 1 to the left. This notion, this beautiful liberal notion, somewhat not just liberal but somewhat redemptive notion, that as Martin Luther King said, the arc of history bends towards justice, no matter how slowly, I think needs to be qualified. It bends towards justice, but there are ups and downs and kinks in that arc. It's not a solid arc, and we really need to understand that, because we need to understand how there's action and reaction. And how so much of what we call queerphobia or homophobia or transphobia in Africa is a reaction towards rights that have been claimed by new generations of people who in previous generations didn't feel free to, or didn't even know that they could, or even didn't think that there were rights to claim. They just were on the down low doing their stuff, or working within traditional pre-colonial forms which are really not about rights or identity, but more about practice and behavior. So much of what we call transphobia and homophobia is a reaction, and this, I've learned this not just from Africa, but elsewhere in the world, is a reaction to the space that we have claimed. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that, to acknowledge our agency, and to acknowledge that we, in claiming space, are always going to be in a, well, not all, hopefully not always, but are more likely than not going to be in some kind of, it could be a conversation or it could be a war with people who are threatened by that space being claimed. So I think that's, there are other lessons I can mention, but which I'm happy to, but I think that's a primary one.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. Xeenarh, I'd like to come to you. Do you have any thoughts on what Mark has said? Especially, I like the fact that you said there's a dance between that legal form and the social change. And for me, I'm just really keen to find out what's the state of play in regards to sexuality and gender identity, queerness in Nigeria.
I have to agree with what Mark said, that there's actually this dance going on by the legal and the social implications of this fight, this line that really has been drawn between different groups who are struggling, for lack of a better word, for dominance on what happens to culture and the way that we're seen in different countries. Personally, right now, as I usually say, culture is such a double-edged sword in the work that it does, in both advancing and sometimes reversing rights in regards to sexual orientation and gender identity. On the one hand, just as it has been shown in the books, this idea of globalization and the fact that people can have access to technologies from around the world, to shows from around the world that introduce you to queerness, to let you know that you're not alone, also puts fear in other people who are not really ready for change, right? And it also empowers people who are in the opposition, who are working very hard to reverse the gains that are being made both in the media and also in the legal landscapes. As the book has shown very clearly, that as progress was being made around the world, conservatives from around America, especially, who were losing the war in the front lines, decided that Africa was the new frontier, where they could push back rights or sometimes hold the lines to ensure that a lot of their beliefs that they had, which was being eroded, could then be instilled here. So even where people were fighting simply for decriminalization, they insisted that people were fighting, for example, for same-sex marriage. And they managed to instill fear and horror in people. They managed to make allies with various nationalist groups, where they could overlap both racism, sexism, homophobia, and every other ism that is negative, and roll it into one with religion and say, here, take it and run with it. So this various really problematic bodies coming together have ensured that a lot of the progress that would have been possible with globalization has mainly stalled and sometimes been reversed. But again, as change comes, it happens slowly in both ways. We've lost a couple of, we've lost some and we've won and gained some. As Nigeria has been tracking the acceptance or the normalization of queerness by doing a biannual survey to see if people's reactions to sexual orientation and gender identity has been changing, we can see that it has. Mark's book is one of those who really goes down into the nitty-gritty, talking about from the first Pew Research in 2013, right? That, for instance, showed that only 2% of Nigerians were in support of rights for people who identified as LGBTQ. We can then see from there that steadily up until 2019, 2020, the number has slightly increased. This shows us that there is some progress where people are beginning to accept LGBT people, But unfortunately, the reality is also somewhat different, because since after that Pew Research, where only 2% of people thought that it was okay for LGBT people in Nigeria to have rights, now we have the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act. So legally, we've lost a big chunk of rights, but also in the society, we've gained a huge acceptance where up to 30% of people have now changed their minds as to the rights that should belong to LGBT people. So there are gains that have been made, and there are also very obvious pitfalls that have been made. People are now being open about who they are. We have a lot more allies who are speaking up very publicly about their support for LGBT rights, which would not have been something that was acceptable. Even though, again, just like, I hate to say that Africa is not a country, yes, but there are some things that are very common. In Malawi, in Auntie's case, we can see that a lot of people think that she's actually pretending to be trans because she wants money from foreigners, or that foreign bodies and Westerners are tunneling and funneling in money so that they can change beliefs. It's the same belief here in Nigeria, where people genuinely think that there aren't LGBT people and that we're all claiming to be queer because of money. So there are a lot of overlapping things around the continent, which was clearly shown in the book, which was what made it so resonated. And you could clearly see that people who pick up and read this book would be like, yeah, this is exactly like the country I live in.
Nickita, I want to pull you in. What are your thoughts on what's just been discussed?
I can echo what Xeenarh and Mark have said about this dance or discordance between law reform and social change across many of the regions on the continent. And I want to just refer to a piece that I just remembered that I wrote last year. We were a few months into lockdown, and basically a few months into lockdown, members of parliament voted to adopt the Civil Union Amendment Action into law. And the bill before this ruling allowed a marriage officer to inform the minister that they object on the grounds of conscience, religion, and belief to solemnizing a civil union between same-sex couples. Now, the effect of this bill is to remove the conscientious objection clause in the Civil Union Act, meaning marriage officers as public servants employed by the Department of Home Affairs wouldn't be allowed to refuse to perform a civil union ceremony. Now, what was interesting is that when this story came when it was announced, the ruling, it came in a press release statement that came from a church to me. And I'm someone who, a lot of my stories for the past year have been talking about this like site of tension between consolidating your queer identity and religion and within religious institutions. So I thought it was one of the churches I had been in communication with for some past stories who were telling me good news, but it wasn't that at all. And basically it was this nonprofit Christian organization called Freedom of Religion. And according to them, the bill proposed the removal of civil marriage officers' right to conscientious objection, a right which protects marriage officers employed by the state from being forced to preside over marriage unions if it would violate their conscious or sincerely held beliefs. So it was a group of elite Christians who were saying, this is unacceptable. What about our rights? In a country where we are seen as quite a progressive or have quite a progressive constitution when it comes to sexuality and gender variation. So I think that for me is quite a clear and recent example of how this dance that you're talking about, Mark, between law reform and social change, because what that church was communicating to quite a big mainstream media publication was that we are leaders of a community and we say that this is not okay. The law says it is, but the community or the community that they are leading is denying that it is something that should happen, something that is right, something that is morally correct. And it's something that we're consistently going through across the continent, across regions where we have a law that upholds human rights of queer people, but if I'm existing in a community where I'm around a bunch of different people all the time, if I'm in a family home where Perhaps my family goes to a church where the leader says, no, this is a sin. Homosexuality is a sin. I'm not, that law, I don't know how far or extensively that law is going to affect me in my everyday life, which is a common thing that happens when these laws are being changed. But I do think that this generation sees that there's an opportunity, a rising one, for people to access a sense of liberation through claiming their queerness and being visible. This claiming of queer identity solidifies that there is an existence of this group of people. They have been here, always been here, but now we have words to say that we're here. We have movements to say that we're here.
You know, the landmark case for shifting ideas globally, the benchmark case, was that extraordinary referendum in Ireland in 2014, where the majority of Irish people, you know, Ireland, supposedly a conservative Catholic country, voted, a big majority, like 66% or something like that, voted in favor of changing the constitution to permit same-sex marriage. Astonishing. How did this happen? And there are many explanations for it. And what one is that the church had lost its moral credibility because of all the accusations of pedophilia and abuse. But another reason was given to me by the Irish writer Colm Tóibín, and I really like it. And I think we can apply it back home too. And the reason he gave is, he said, Ireland is an intimate society. Everybody knows everybody. And because there's been increased visibility, everybody in Ireland now knows somebody who's gay. Their mother, their father, their son, their daughter, their teacher, their postman, their butcher, their baker. And once it's physicalized in a person, rather than this demonic evil that you hear about in church, you think, but I love that person. That person's good to me. How can there be a problem? Now, you know, as Xeenarh said, you know, Africa is not a country, and Africa as a continent cannot be an intimate continent. There's just too many of us. But all continents are made up of countries and people and clans, and we all live in intimate societies. And one of the biggest lessons I got from my book was how no matter what the people I was writing about were up against, in terms of their church, the law, the state, violence on the streets, there was an intimate pool of people who knew them and loved them and would support them. And it's about expanding that intimate pool, and through the mechanism of visibility. But visibility is a complex mechanism in societies where sex and sexuality is not spoken about. You know, Africans do not talk about sex and sexuality the way Europeans do, and it's complex when the stakes are really high, when the danger is high. So we have to approach the visibility issue with caution. But I do think that Irish lesson is an interesting one. I wanted to ask you, Kevin, about the dance between law and social change in your country, because you were part of a really significant decriminalization case to get homosexuality decriminalized, homosexual practice decriminalized in Kenya. You lost the case. I mean, you're taking it on appeal. When I say you, I mean Kenyan queer activists. You lost the case, but the sense I get, and I want to check this with you, is that something did shift just by fighting the case and just by being visible and just by putting your narratives in the world, in terms of extending allies, in terms of getting broader acceptance. And I wonder if that's true. Can you lose a battle legally, but win some space in terms of a shift to social norms?
Mark, as you spoke there, tears came to my eyes, and I got goose pimples, because soon after that ruling was given, I had to write a piece for the BBC, and it was emotional writing that piece, you know, and I think I cried a little bit as I was writing it, but I had to tell people we had won a war, we had won a battle, but we hadn't won the war, because for the first time, I think the very fact that this was such a huge case in Kenya and people were talking about it, all the media stations, the court was full, we were jostling with camera people, journalists to get into space, into the actual courtroom. Everybody knew about it. You know, there were demonstrators outside, but the thing is, Mark, there were people within the corridors of justice that I saw who would not have been seen publicly surrounding us. The fact that we had the rainbow flag on people, draped on T-shirts within the Kenyan law system, within the walls, within the judiciary, within the Supreme Court, was saying so much, because I would say maybe 15 years ago, we were so scared of even thinking of this. We didn't even let ourselves dream about going to court and saying this needs to be decriminalized. We hadn't dreamt about that, but we did it. And the first time they postponed the case and we were leaving the court, we had someone shout from one of the registries saying, "We are with you." And they said that in Kiswahili. That just shows there is a lot more acceptance now, just like what Xeenarh said here in Kenya, there is a lot more acceptance now. And like what you said, people know someone, and I think I like what Xeenarh said earlier on about that normalization of our queerness, of our sexual identities. And I think that is a beautiful strategy as we move forward in fighting for our rights across the continent. Normalization. And I'm a big champion of visibility. If you see us, if you feel us, if you know our stories as queer people, people's hearts hopefully will soften, because we're their daughters, we're their wives, we're their husbands, we're their sons, we're their nephews, we're their uncles, we are them. And that's the thing I'm trying to push, and we are you as much as you are us. And I think that's the way we're moving forward about it. That's where it is. There is a dance. I mean, we have a very good constitution, and it was baffling sitting in court where people were saying, yes, the Constitution says you have rights, but no, because of moral reasons. And we couldn't quite understand that, and we're all baffled, like, what did they just say? But the fact that we were in court, we were sitting on stairs and just listening was for me a victory in itself. And people know that we do exist, and for me, that is a huge achievement. And I also want to throw this back at the three of you. And it's so easy to talk about the bad that is happening on the continent, but I just think there's so much that is happening within the communities and the movements across different parts of the continent in terms of championing queer rights. Could you tell us a good story or something that the world doesn't know about an opportunity or the gains that have been made in championing for queer rights on the continent?
We all know that in Nigeria, Nollywood is big, and it plays such a huge effect on what ends up being culturally acceptable in Nigeria. And also our music industry is so big, and the artists there end up affecting not just Nigeria, but also other countries on the continent. So we started working a couple of years ago, just tracking down. Unamazua did this very important study about 15 years ago about the stories being told by Nollywood, LGBT representation, and how much harm it did. And then since then has been tracking LGBT, the way we're being represented in Nollywood. Since then, in the past 3 years, there has only been one movie that has been made with a negative portrayal of LGBT people, right? And it was made specifically in support of the same-sex marriage prohibition, right? But they got such a backlash that the movie has not been shown anywhere since its first week in the theaters, right? The people who participated in it have been shamed publicly by their peers and by people in the industry. They've taken it off online. You can check everything about the movie, where at this point you can barely find one article talking about it. On the other hand, there are now positive representations of LGBT rights, which are coming up both in books, in movies, in series, in music.
Outside of Nigeria, I would choose two stories. The first is, well, two and a half. The first is Sudan, of all places, where last year the revolutionary government of Abdallah Hamdok decided in a raft of gender-related reforms that it was going to move Sudan out of the death camp. In other words, that no matter what Sharia says, you will no longer, being found guilty of homosexuality no longer carries the death penalty in Sudan. And look, you know, it's still illegal, small steps. But what was interesting to me was that the Sudanese government decided to include this in its package of reforms. And what the Justice Minister said about it, which was that we are moving from a repressive society to a free and open society, and that the Sudanese were calculating the way South Africans did when we moved from apartheid to democracy, that if you're going to talk about an opening up of society, if you're going to talk about democracy, if you're going to talk about freedom, if you're going to talk about human rights, you've got to be universal about it. You've got to look at everybody. And it was amazing to see the Sudanese beginning to do that. So that's my one. My other story is on the other side of the continent, two countries, Angola and Mozambique, where homosexual activity has been decriminalized. And in both instances, there has been really focused activism from the LGBTQ community, particularly in Mozambique. But in both instances, the governments were pretty proactive themselves, because they were seeing the way the world was changing, and they wanted to identify themselves with, if you like, modernity, and mirroring Nigeria, Xeenarh, is the way that the big change happened in Angola because of popular culture, because the most famous musical celebrity in Angola is somebody called Titica. And Titica is a transgender. She does, I forget the name of it. She does Angolan rap. There's a particular name for it. And she's trans, and everybody loves her. And there was a way that Titica, being trans and being openly trans, just kind of diffused the debate, normalized the matter.
Mark, the genre of music that you were looking for is kuduro. Yeah, Titica's a kuduro star. I love her.
Kuduro.
Yeah. Yeah, I think both my fellow panelists speaking about art and the way that the movement uses art as a liberation portal is something that is happening across the continent, through writing, through visual artwork like Zanele Moholi, who is literally capturing the lives of communities that people believe don't exist. And she is saying, we do exist. These communities do exist. And I'm going to show you the faces within these communities. So I think that that's something that just across the board I find to be a great positive story.
For me, it's the element of culture. And I think it's important to recognize how big a role the internet is playing on the continent right now. You know, if we look at how, especially in Nigeria, two of my good news stories was the End SARS movement and how the queer community in Nigeria made themselves really visible. And that was, for me, that happened. I'm like, we're owning this. We're owning this as much as you. And Xeenarh, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being there. And that, I think you don't know how big that is for us who are outside of that. For me, mine was Pride Afrique, which was a group of us who came together and organized an online Pride festival, you know? And it was exciting getting people for 3 days online talking about, and we're talking about African queerness. It was an African event. And I think the internet democratized that pride for us, especially here on the continent. People could just get their data bundles, even if it was for a brief period. And for me, the key thing was they were able to see themselves and other queer Africans. In light of that, what do you guys think? Are there other opportunities that I'm an activist, those of us who are in the movement, those of us who are in the community here on the continent need to capitalize on? We've mentioned culture. Are we missing any other trick?
It could be a cliche, but the law is such a good tool, right, for sometimes accelerating progress. It's not always a blanket thing, because we've seen places like South Africa where it ends up that the law is great, but culture doesn't catch up quickly to it. But reading the judgment in the Botswana case made me weep. I felt seen. I felt supported. I felt so much hope, right? And to see the kind of people who supported the decriminalization in Botswana, even though it wasn't a short-term project, it took about 10 years to eventually get to decriminalization. But reading the judge's summary and the way she humanized queer people and said queerness is not new. These are not different Botswana people. These are the people we've always seen and known, and we're only publicly saying that the rights that belong to everyone belong to these queer Botswana people too. So for me, it was so important, and to not see any visible pushback from the country, because one of the things that we've seen is that when there's legal progress, sometimes there's a lot of pushback. That hasn't significantly happened in Botswana. I know that they quickly tried to mount an appeal when, again, evangelists from outside the continent came and started putting pressure and wanted to see the rights that were extended reversed. But the law is such a strong tool. And I say this with a caveat because I'm also a lawyer and I significantly love the law. But it's such a big tool sometimes for seeing how people can be defended and where people's rights can be reinstated, where other people have said that because of their own religion or because of their own customary beliefs, that they don't think that those rights belong to other people.
Well, you know, there's something about the law, Xeenarh, which is that as well as the rules it makes, it tells a story. I mean, you'll know as a lawyer that a trial is about sort of two competing stories, right? I mean, one has to. For me, it's about. I totally agree with you about the law, but within the frame of the objective is shifting the narrative, changing the story, and what that judge did in that extraordinary Botswana decriminalization judgment of 2019 was she shifted the narrative by accepting one story that was being told to her and rejecting the other story that was being told to her as lies, because they are lies. That this is a Western invention, that it's something that's not part of our culture. So for me, the opportunities are around shifting the narrative, and we've spoken about. We've spoken powerfully about how popular culture shifts narrative. We've spoken about how films and songs shift narrative. Literature shifts narrative too, and I particularly want to mention this in the context of a forum hosted by Commonwealth Writers, because Commonwealth Writers is about writing in books and stories, and you know. This is a continent that really respects its writers, that really respects the written word, despite the terrible problems we have with illiteracy still in so many parts of our continent. You know, writers have status in Africa. Writers have heft. Look at the role in Nigeria of Wole Soyinka. Look at the role in Kenya of Ngugi. Shifting the narrative at the upper end through literature is, I think, really important. Shifting the narrative in a more popular way through the media, even in this age of citizen journalism, even in this age of the death of newspapers, the research shows that Africans trust the news. Perhaps they shouldn't, but they do. And Nickita, I'm sure you can talk about this because you work very actively in news media.
Yeah, I think I agree completely with what Mark is saying in terms of utilizing the media and mainstream media as a tool to normalize the differences, right? And I think that what the media can also be doing more is initiating more honest discussions on human sexuality in the African context, and not only talking about it in the present sense, but also talking about what what sexuality on the African context looked like during and after the colonial period. And I think that this is a conversation that local activists, civil society, and academics have been having and shaping, but I think it can happen more. It can happen in our households more. It can happen within our communities more. And like you said, Mark, people read and believe the newspapers. I think through this conversation in media, we can start to reclaim our forgotten past as peoples who traditionally refused to hate, but stood side by side and embraced their differences. So I'm talking about community and using people on the community level to have these chats and to humanize these experiences and to kind of have an integration that is happening organically, can I say, with the help of leaders, with the help of activists, with the help of media. Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned the An-African thing. I think that argument we're hearing a lot less these days because of the work that has been happening, because of the normalization of our existence, and I think that's a good thing. And I'd sort of like us to change gear a little bit here. Mark, you mentioned Mozambique and Angola. It's interesting to note that right across Lusophone or Portuguese-speaking Africa, homosexuality has been decriminalized. You know, why are we seeing more movement? Or the panel, why are we seeing more movement happening within, or why are we seeing more movement happening within Lusophone Africa than we're seeing in Anglophone Africa and Francophone Africa? I mean, last year we had, it was either last year or the year before, I can't remember, where we had Gabon joining that bandwagon of decriminalizing, but we're not seeing as much movement, especially in Anglophone Africa.
I think what it comes down to is on the Anglophone side, is two inhibitors, two very significant inhibitors to change. The first is evangelical Christianity and its link with American evangelical Christianity in the way that Xeenarh described. Now, it's not as if there aren't huge evangelical movements in Lusophone and Francophone Africa. You know, Congo, enormous. Angola, enormous, and it's a Brazilian evangelical movement in Angola. But there's not a similar doctrine. There's not a similar a script of political homophobia, a similar culture wars script that was written by the American evangelical movement to gain political power in the United States, a script used by African evangelical movements in countries like Uganda in particular, like Nigeria, like Ghana, like Uganda. So I would say that's one reason. I think the second reason has to do with the roots of the law itself, which is that many Francophone African countries don't even have anti-sodomy laws. And those Francophone and Lusophone countries that do have anti-sodomy laws kind of pick them up along the way in strange ways. Whereas in the Anglophone countries, they were very much part of the Victorian Penal Code that they inherited from Britain. So much more deeply lodged into the law, even though not really used until recently, when they've begun to be used as backlash tools. They've always been there. They've always been understood to be part of a legal tradition that kind of predates the democratic constitutionalism that countries like Uganda, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Botswana now have. So what happens in those countries, in the Anglophone countries, is a new battle between a kind of colonial era law and contemporary constitutionalism. And the Francophone and Lusophone countries don't have that battle?
I really completely agree with Mark. I feel like the law is such an important reason why Lusophone Africa, for example, is being able to move quickly away from enshrined homophobia in the way that it was not really handed down like received English law, like a lot of us were. And also, I think that it might have a way in which the countries that colonized Lusophone countries see themselves, right? The ideals in which they hold stronger, where they see themselves to be better and societies who aim to do more. It wasn't always the same with like Anglophone Africa, and in the ways that we really did hold tight to colonial laws that were passed down to us. And I really, really completely believe that the work of evangelicals has really continued to do a lot of harm, right? This playbook, just like Mark has said, is simply something they borrow. You can see it as it happens, right? The fear that they try to instill in places, the way they whip up hate. It's almost just like they photocopy. They're like, here you go, here's yours, go on, we'll give you some money, go on and be great. And we're beginning to learn from that now and copy the ways in which other people have pushed back against those kind of strategies to do better in Anglophone West Africa, for instance. And I think it's so important that the way that countries see themselves and other countries like themselves end up affecting what they do. As other countries begin to decriminalize, especially those which are Portuguese speaking, and eventually, hopefully, those who are French speaking, it would make it easier for other countries that speak similar language, that have very close cultures, to be able to see that decriminalization or just accepting people who are our family does not do the kind of harm that foreigners have insisted it does.
The evangelists, they're starting where the missionaries left off. And it's making the process a very, very long and much harder one. But I just want to read a quote from a paper that I read yesterday that says, another bold position on the influence of the British colonial experience on LGBT rights is that not only did the British bring the laws that criminalize homosexual conduct to their colonies, but that they somehow poisoned the prospects for liberalization and repeal of those laws. And I think that theorized legacy is something that has been spoken about in different ways today. And it's something that's important, you know, if we look at what does it mean, what does it look like, what is being used to refer to that law being legitimate, that law still standing, and that law preventing human beings from having their human rights protected in this day and age.
Thank you for sharing that as well, Nickita. Next question is, I'd like to ask you, what would a queer Africa look like in 10 years' time? And I recognize that there is, and I think it's important to mention that there's so much happening on the continent. Where we are as a queer Africa now is not where we were 10 years ago. You know, I strongly believe that there is a movement in almost every African country right now. I'm excited to see what the next 10 years will be.
When I hear queer Africa in 10 years' time, I want to describe my fantasies for a queer utopia, which just is about art and freedom from the shackles of capitalism and being free to love and all of that. But I think in reality, we're a generation of endurance, curiosity, and empathy, that we are willing and able to take on this fight for equality. And I think we've seen that. I think we're seeing it picking up more steam as we go, and as we're integrating the queer movement and the queer fight for human dignity, where it's being integrated in the human fight, the human race fight for dignity and protection of that dignity. So I see more of that happening. I see a lot more healing, unlearning, and united uprisings against laws that come from Europeans in the first place happening, more telling of our own stories and contributing to archives that people to follow will have access to, the way that maybe some of us are only having access to now. So yeah, continuing fighting the erasure of communities and identity, continuing to claim ourselves and our histories. And in that claiming, we're not separating our identities of Africanness and queerness. They are within this one body, so they are coexisting. That's what I see happening in 10 years.
Just like Nickita says, for me, the biggest thing I want to see in a queer Africa is a reclaiming of our history, right? Queer people have been deliberately written out of the history and the stories of Africa. People have removed the normalization of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. And I want us to be written back into those histories where we reclaim it. I want us to use languages in our tribe to describe who we are and to reclaim our position, which has always been within society. I think it's very important, just like Mark shows, that when Auntie was in her village and when she did her first introductory marriage, she didn't know what the word gay was. She just knew that she was a woman who was getting married to a man. And we need to return to that, because one of the things that are always being said is that this is an imported concept. But no, it isn't. In all of our histories, there are diverse histories of queerness in Yoruba culture, in Igbo culture, in Hausa culture, right? So we need to take up that space and put people back where they have been removed. So I want to see young people really, because we've also seen it in many places, right? In Mark's story, we can see Michael, where the first time he saw him and subsequently how he came into himself. So I want to see more young queers coming into themselves, taking up space and asserting themselves. When we all started out in activism, I know that we were not this fierce, we weren't this visible, right? So I see a queer Africa where we've assimilated into society, and most especially we've reclaimed family. So one of the things that has been going on in the past few years, which the opposition has always used in this gender war, is reclaiming or trying to own family values. But queer people have rights to families. I have a right to still express love with my grandmother, to still have access to my parents, to my siblings, to my cousins, to be embraced, to have that society's acceptance. And I want us to see, I want us to be able to reclaim that and to push back on this idea of hate, where one person's sexuality is a reason why you think that they should be ostracized from people who are related to them by blood. So I'm looking for a queer Africa that reclaims all of its people, right? And does not shun anyone because of whom we love.
I love your emphasis on reclamation. And one of the other lessons I learned globally, and it's a lesson I learned from India, was how, in India, there was a very powerful decriminalization movement that ultimately led to the repeal of 377, which was the original colonial anti-homosexuality law. And the victory wasn't that repeal, because that took forever. The victory was the visibility that came about in the campaign. And what was so powerful about that campaign was the way, both in the media, but also in the courtroom, the queer movement and its allies referenced global universal human rights culture, but also values and traditions that were specifically Indian. The gender fluidity of Hindu deities as seen on the Mahabharata. The philosophy of Nehru, the founder of the Indian nation, and his philosophy about how people should be able to choose whom they love rather than have arranged marriages, which you can kind of read across onto queer marriage from sort of intercaste or interfaith marriages. And as you said, there are such traditions. When I was doing my very limited research in Nigeria for this book, unfortunately I don't have a whole chapter on Nigeria, I was just absolutely fascinated to hear how a younger generation of Yoruba people were looking back into the Yoruba cosmology and finding finding themselves in it, in the way that that many queer South Africans are finding themselves, gender non-conforming queer South Africans are finding space for themselves in the vocation of being healers, because if you present in a way that's very different to the gender that's been assigned to you, it can be said that you're very close to a male ancestor if you were born in a female body, or vice versa. And this proximity to the ancestors can be a gift. I think that's hugely important for us to do. I'm wondering, Kevin, whether to answer your question as what would I like to see in 10 years, or what do I think we will see in 10 years? And I want to caution us against a kind of redemptive fantasy, because I think that we're learning about action and reaction, as I said, about claiming space and there being that being so threatening to some people when that space is claimed. And I do think that with everything we've spoken about on this panel, there is going to be a lot more advancement in culture, in law, in literature, in the media, but there is also going to be more backlash, or let's not say more backlash. Who knows how much backlash there will be, but it will be there. And one area I want to signal where we are going to see backlash, because we have not yet seen it here, but it's happening in other parts of the world, and we need to be ready for it, is in this new battle against something called gender ideology, that's being led specifically by the Catholic Church and by evangelicals and the Russian Orthodox Church. And this notion that it is a new way that children are being corrupted, with a narrative that gender is something constructed rather than God-given by the Lord. And you even have Pope Francis, and there are many, many Catholics on our continent. You even have Pope Francis saying that this is a form of ideological colonization, to teach that a boy can become a girl or a girl can become a boy. It's becoming a global movement with great force, particularly in Latin America and in Eastern Europe, because it does what the homophobes can no longer do. The homophobes used to be able to say, we have to keep gays away from our children because they're going to corrupt our children. They're going to turn our children into gay. They're going to molest our children. That becomes increasingly difficult as more and more people know queer people and know that queer people are not child molesters. So there needs to be a new way of mounting a battle by protecting children. And that battle is increasingly around the curriculum. And we will see that happen in Africa. And we need to be ready for it if we're going to think ahead and be strategic as people who care about the freedom and equality of queer people. So unfortunately, more of those battles ahead, but more space, more confidence in all the ways that we've been speaking about on this call.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. In closing, I just want to end with something that you wrote in the book, and this comes out from one of the chapters in Egypt. And for me, it springs of hope, and the fact that it is this queer Africa of ours is attainable, and there have been flashes of it every now and then. It's taken from someone who had been interviewed in Tahrir Square, and I'll read. The revolution changed all this. It gave me this sense of unity, this urge to get out of my safe bubbles within the new platform of activism. We were all in the square, straight, queer, Sunni, Shia, Muslim, Copt. I was aware that the square was very diverse. Why couldn't society be the same? I know we're on there. It might take a little bit longer than we'd like, but we're definitely on there. Nickita, Xeenarh, Mark, thank you so much for a fantastic panel. Thank you for educating me, for sharing, and for just showing that it is possible. And we need to take advantage of the law, literature, the media, and give our own queerness our language. Because I think, just in response to what you said about gender ideology, I think once we get our language back on our queerness, on our identity as Africans, as queer Africans, we'll be able to defend ourselves and what is ours. Have a lovely day wherever you're at. And it is possible. Cheers.
Welcome all to the Pink Line Q&A. I'm Janet Steele, the Programme Manager for Commonwealth Writers, Cultural Initiative of the Commonwealth Foundation. And I'll be moderating this session as Kevin Mwachiro is sadly unwell and unable to be with us today. Now, we have some great questions posted by the audience, but please feel free to post any additional ones in the Q&A function in Zoom as we go along. We only have 30 minutes. So I'll start right away with the first question, which is for you, Mark. And that is, do you think your book, The Pink Line, can reach the hearts and minds of the population and can change attitudes towards LGBTQ+ people in a positive way? And that's from Klaus in Germany.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you, Klaus, for that question. In my many years as a journalist, and particularly covering the South African transition to apartheid, one of the things I've really come to hold to is the idea that the way of changing people's minds, the way of changing the narrative, is by telling stories, and by telling stories about people so that an idea like gay or gender ideology or pedophilia or all these things that circle around as threats to a community become sort of expelled and are replaced by narratives of flesh and blood people who the reader or the viewer, if it's television, or the listener, if it's radio, come to recognize as people like themselves, their brothers, their sisters, their mothers, their fathers, their neighbors, their friends. And because of this reason, I hope it came through in the presentation you just heard. My book is very much about big ideas around the pink line, but these big ideas are lodged in very intimate and specific stories about very real people whom I hope come to life. And I do believe that by sharing stories of ourselves, we work to change perceptions of ourselves.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark. Now, my second question, that's for you, Nickita. So it goes like this. It sounds inspiring looking at how far we've come, but as a young person, sometimes all you see is how far there is to go. Do you think celebrating how far we have come makes it harder to keep pushing for change? And that's anonymous, so I don't know where that one's from, I'm afraid.
Thanks for that question, Anonymous and Janet. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here, and I'm so grateful that I'm able to be here. I first want to echo the context that we're currently holding a space like this in, which is that we have siblings in East Africa whose very present reality is one of violence and neglect. And I'd like to take this moment to share the appeal by a number of queer rights and advocacy organizations, the urgent appeal to the necessary players that can do something, who can help the current situation, which is on the 15th of March, 2 gay refugees were set on fire while they slept at Block 13 in Kakuma camp by homophobes. They sustained severe burn injuries across their bodies and are at a facility that cannot provide them with the medical care they need. This is a global appeal, a clarion call to help them, help human beings who have been met by the brunt of discrimination because of who they are. Thank you for that moment. Now to go to the question, which I think speaks to that moment being taken. I think it's really important for us to be present in the time that we're in as much as we are existing in this virtual world. I think social justice, movement towards change and equity is a journey that will be continuous for a very long time. This movement involves and is for so many groups of people within a larger group that is the LGBTIQ persons. So when we try to articulate the destination of all of the work being done, I think that presents itself as a challenge to us. We can talk about legislative change, but if we make reference to, for example, my context, my geographical context of South Africa, having laws and policies that say same-sex marriage is legal doesn't mean that we have total liberation and freedom, right? There's still so much work that needs to be done regarding societal acceptance of gender and sexuality diversity in a society and a world that has been intentionally constructed to be exclusionary to minorities. So as we celebrate the wins, which I totally encourage and I contribute to through my storytelling as a journalist and writer, I don't think things are made harder to keep pushing for change. And that's because of how different and how versatile our struggles are. Yes, they intersect at points of them being about human dignity, inclusion, and equity when it comes to rights and access, but I don't think acknowledgement and appreciation of one win means we stop. And I think, or at least I'd like to believe, that the movement is quite clear on that as part of its mandate. Thanks for the question.
Brilliant, thanks, Nickita. So Xeenarh, I've got a question for you, and this comes from Peter in Fiji. As a gay activist and poet based in Fiji, when I see the panels being constructed around the world, I wonder, do we all work in silos? Is our work in our regions and the issues affecting the LGBTQ bodies so large that we cannot see beyond our own spaces?
Thanks for the question. I actually think that there are multiple ways to see that, in the sense that the work that we do and the issues that we face are big and diverse, in a way that sometimes it can be reactive. But I don't believe that we work in silos. I see work being done by activists and organizations that transcends borders and transcends movements. I see work being done by people who work in SRHR together with the people who work on LGBT rights. For example, I know activists in Fiji, for example, Nolene. Nolene and I have worked together at the UN with Outright. So I do believe that although we don't work in a silo, that there's still space where we can work together more and better and more strategic, because the people who oppose our rights actually share the work that they do. And I think that in opposing the rolling back of our rights, that we could do better in partnering and working together with local organizations, especially from the global south. There needs to be more cooperation and more partnerships. So no, we don't work in silos, but there's still space for more partnerships.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with that. And I'm sure the rest of the panel would as well. Is there a few nods? Yeah, some nods going on there. Okay, so this is a question from Peterborough. And this one I'm just going to put to three of you, because you will possibly have three different answers to this. And I think they'll all be really interesting and really useful for the viewers. So the question is, hi, I'm watching from Peterborough in the UK. Which poets or writers of the African continent would you say recently have made significant steps forward for LGBTQ progress? Whose stories are making the change? So who would like to go first? Great, Xeenarh, off you go.
I'm always excited about storytelling and how that ends up pushing for change. I mean, who could be better than Mark, who's been doing this for a long, long time? So we're already lucky enough that we have Mark here with us. But then we also have amazing writers. I could list them off. We have someone like Frank Edozian. We have someone like Odumide Popola, Chinelo Oparanta. But most especially, right, we're beginning to have writers who write not about our struggles, but about our joy. We have poets like, what's her name, Tiffany Kagure Mugo. We have people like Rafiat Aliyu. We have people like Nana who are writing about pleasure and BDSM in the queer community. So there's a diversity of artists and people who are making a difference. Also, someone like Akweke Emezi is writing bodies of work every year and being recognized as a non-binary writer around the world. So there are tons of artists who are making a difference and who are pushing for change. We also have artists who are working within movie spaces, who are making movies and audio visuals for people who can consume, and that is able to change things.
Great, thank you. So Nickita, you had your hand up first. So
Oh no, that wasn't a hand up. I was saying yes. 'Cause all of that list was great. But if I could add to the list, I would definitely mention Koleka Putuma. She has a series or collection, I guess, called Collective Amnesia, which is just her work prompts justice, visibility, and healing for women and queer people. She's doing really amazing work, and I think we're really grateful to have her telling stories the way that she does. To add to the list, Maneo Mohale, who's a brilliant writer whose words emanate tenderness. Their book, Everything is a Deathly Flower, is available. And then, let me add one more person. Kopano Moroja. Their work is called Jesus, Thesis, and Other Critical Fabulations, I think. I hope I got that right. Also provocative, tender explorations of the self and religion. Yeah, there's so much work out there. Did really brilliant work also. Yeah.
Mark, did you want to add?
I think that I want to build on what Nickita said about there's so much work out there, and hey, isn't that incredible? Who would have thought even 10 years ago that we could sit in a panel like this, hosted by Commonwealth Writers, and speak about the extent of queer writing in Africa, of how much there is, rather than moaning about how little there is. And I do think that's been a phenomenon of the past decade. There are, of course, the mums and dads, the Binyavanga Wainanas, the Unoma Azuas, the Jude Dibias, whose work really stands the test of time. They were the pioneers. But it's been really extraordinary to see what I think we could call a queer renaissance of literature in Africa recently. Young writers, as Xeenarh said, who are not just writing about struggle, even though, my Lord, we still need to carry on writing about struggle, but are writing about their lives, about themselves, as lovers, as mothers, as fathers. I am a judge on an amazing prize, an anthology called the Gerald Clark Awards. And every year we select a shortlist. There are 3 judges, and we publish an anthology. And this anthology is a remarkable compendium of really the explosive power of queer ideas in writing in Africa. And what I think is so exciting about this writing, and please go and find those anthologies. It's Gerald, Gerald, Clark, Kraak, anthology, is the way queer voices have come to represent a powerful new oppositional, global yet rooted, forward-thinking, challenging African voice, which all of those words could be pseudonyms for queer, and I think that's incredibly exciting.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for that. Maybe we can grab some of those names from you all and put them in our website or put them on our Facebook so everybody can go to them and find them. Xeenarh, I have a question for you from David in Northcote. It says, good day from Bermuda. Thanks for a great discussion. We are awaiting the outcome of an anti-marriage equality appeal at the UK Supreme Court. This is the first time we have used the courts to achieve LGBTQ+ equality. Previously, we have done it through Parliament. Do the panelists see the use of the courts as the primary arena for fighting for rights across different African countries, or do they see other arenas as primary?
Thanks for that very good question. I believe that it's very important that we continue to focus on fighting inside the courtroom because it enshrines our rights as not a privilege, but a right, no ifs, no buts. But there are other super important arenas that have to go hand in hand with the courts. right? You can have a very beautiful law, a beautiful constitution like South Africa has shown us, but if people's minds are not changed, then we're unlikely to have the rights or the powers that should belong to LGBT people. So I believe that the media is also a super important space that is just as important a frontier as the courts and in parliament, that these three things have to go hand in hand together.
Thank you very much. So, Mark, another question here from a budding writer. Many times, knowing what I do about myself and queer people, I have been moved to pen narratives around queerness, but I don't. There is a feeling of insecurity I get when I try to do this. I know the power of stories and the storyteller, but I am unsure of committing myself to activism, whether behind a mask or not. I don't know. Is there a way around this? I guess this is an issue for many people.
I really understand that predicament, and it talks to me as well. And it talks to me even as somebody who is not behind a mask, who's out and open, and generally lives and works in a society and environment where there's really no problem being out and open. And even so, I understand. Let's not say I understand. I empathize with that insecurity. So the first question is the first level has to do with visibility, and even though we all understand how important visibility is, because it's only when, as we said in the discussion, when society gets to know that we are among them, that there's going to be change. We also really need to accept the real barriers to visibility, and those barriers can be cultural. They can also be economic. You know, one of the things that I always say to younger people whom I meet and who are on the cusp of coming out, whether it's as trans or as gay or as lesbian or as bi, is I say, are you economically independent? And if you're not economically independent, will it make a difference to your economic status, to your well-being, to your access to shelter and food if you come out? These are really important questions. But even once you answer those questions, there's the issue of am I able to present this story in a way that is going to do what the first questioner, Klaus, said, change people's minds? And that's a huge burden to carry. You know, by telling my story, I'm going to stop, or I'm going to contribute towards stopping the violence, the exorcism that happens in church, the burning that happens in refugee camps. Wow, how do you live with carrying that burden? And I think that, and also another part of that is, do you have the right to tell other people's stories? Particularly given the way the people whose stories you might be helping put into the world have been violated so much, have had their agency taken away from them so much. All of these are complex questions, and I think, I don't know if this is talking to you, but add to the kind of insecurity I think you are referring to. And the only advice I can give is take care of yourself, take care of the people whose stories you seek to tell, and take care of your readers too. Think about who your prospective readers are, and how they're going to respond best to the stories you give them. You know, these are ancient techniques that storytellers in all sorts of cultures, including our African cultures, really hone. You know, when you're sitting around the fire telling a story, you're very conscious of who the people are listening to your story. Are they your grandchildren? Are they your peers? Are they the elders of your community? Understanding who your readership is might also help alleviate some of that insecurity a bit. And most importantly, don't think that your stories or your storytelling must change the world. just do your best and be true to yourself.
Yeah, I think we could talk about different forms of self-censorship for a very long time, but thank you so much for that, Mark. A question, Nickita, this is for you. How do we tell the stories of non-Western queer narratives in a way that makes them accessible to Western consciousnesses? Such stories have the unique challenge of being 2 times removed from public discourse, not straight, not Western. How then, as an artist, do we achieve the urgent task of realizing their emotional urgency on the page and eliciting a response they are deserving of?
Thank you for that question, Janet. I think my response could echo some of the things that Mark mentioned. But in that question, there's something that's so not sensational, but striking to me, which is such stories have the unique challenge of being 2 times removed from public discourse, not straight, not Western, which just reminds me, your troubles are many, Black child, don't forget. But I think the first thing would be to know the platform you'd like to be telling the stories on, because that informs your reach, audience, a lot of the time, right? I think in mainstream media, particularly, the inclusive and affirming stories we tell sometimes get picked up by platforms that have access to said Western consciousness. So I think it's possible for us to be strategic about that. What kind of story are we wanting to have out there, and how do we want it to be told? I think a tactic would be telling stories that contribute to the archival work of our queer experiences through affirming narratives being shared across multiple mediums. And I say multiple mediums because as Africans, our stories, our histories have never been subjected to being shared on one format, right? And I think remembering that and using that reality can help us pierce this Western consciousness when we are talking about ourselves, our journeys, our experiences, and our futures. I believe that mainstream media has the power to challenge imposed hatred on communities, and that's essentially what we're doing when we're telling affirming and inclusive stories. We're challenging a mindset that's been imposed on a group of people or groups of people. And I think that that's something to remember when we're trying to tell stories. And also, like Mark said, not carrying the burden of this being the story to be told in the world. You're telling a version of a story. You're telling a story that represents specific voices amongst so many. And if you can own that positionality, own that experience, and what that experience takes, the journey that experience takes you on, I think that it can be impactful, and it can reach a lot more people than maybe we thought that we would only be reaching.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So Xeenarh, there's one for you from Ibrahim, who says, I live in Nigeria, Kano State. We have a lot of LGBT people in my community, but the problem I'm having is how to promote them to know their rights.
Hi, Ibrahim. I'm really glad that there are people like you who live in Kano and who are looking for ways in which to ensure that more queer people know their rights. I am aware that there are also other people in Kano who are based there who are also doing work to ensure not just that people know their rights, but that they also enforce them. Organizations like AGE, which is Advocates for Grassroots for and Enlightenment, organizations like WISE. So there are people on the ground who are doing the work, and I'm happy to put you in touch with them to ensure that not just that people know their rights, that those rights are protected and they're enforced, but also we have the issue of language. And I'm so glad that people who are based in Kano are beginning to take this bull by the horn and to take it forward to see how LGBT people can live their full and fulfilling lives there.
Brilliant, thanks, Xeenarh. Mark, another question for you. So it says, Mark, your book focuses on individual stories across a range of countries, but as you say, it also tackles the bigger issues. In writing this book, what were some of the similarities you found emerging across borders? What were some of the differences? So condense that very big question.
Well, let me say that one of the things that I found in almost every single country I visited doing this work, and I think there were 21 or 2, that in almost every single country I visited, I met somebody called Beyonce, who was a member of the queer community. And I tell that story for two reasons. Firstly, to make a point about the power of a globalized popular culture and the way this presents certain notions of what it means to be queer, what liberation is, what rights are, what pride is, what a rainbow flag means, that because of the digital revolution, everybody can sign on to. But at the same time, every single one of those Beyoncés I met. Oh, and of course, and part of that, of course, is as well the power of popular culture, and specifically the power of, let's not kid ourselves, of American popular culture. But every single one of those Beyoncés was unique in her own way, or in their own way, because of the way they were from the places they were from: Uganda, India, Philippines, Nigeria. They had perhaps chosen the name of Beyonce and the character of Beyonce because of the need to be fierce. And one does need to be fierce if one's going to be open and visible, because of the challenges against you. But they were, and that is something else that they had in common. That's a commonality, is that everywhere, even in unexpected places, even in places where it seems like, the battle has been won, like South Africa, like the United States, like Mexico. These are countries I write about. There are always doors to go through that have been closed, that you have to open. In this day and age, if you are LGBTQ. And I think that's another commonality I saw across borders. And a similar way, particularly among activists, of pushing the boundaries because of those boundaries. I was really struck, as I mentioned in the discussion we had before, the way that in so many places I visited, the most effective activism had to do with where alliances were made, and specifically alliances with faith leaders, with the media, and with families. There is no activism I've seen as powerful as parents advocating on behalf of their children. I've seen that in Turkey. I've seen that in India. I've seen that very close to home in Botswana. It's really powerful when that happens, because of the fierceness of parents' love for their children once they get there, because of the power that parents who have got there have to persuade other parents who aren't there yet to be able to say, hey, I was once where you are and look where I am now. You see there's progress. Let me show you how to get there. And finally, to persuade other people who are parents and who have children of their own and who can therefore have empathy with these parents with queer children. So that's a partial answer to that big and complicated question.
Yeah, I guess maybe you could read the book. Mark's going to tell you in a little while how people can get a hold of one copy, then they'll be able to see some of the similarities themselves. We don't have much time left, so I'm going to give a quick question. Well, it's not a quick question, but it's quite a short question, so it's quick to read. This is to Nickita, but some others, this was touched on in the conversation earlier. And this is from Cosmata from Babis, Guyana. The question to the panel: is the hostility towards LGBTQ people in Africa rooted in Christian or traditional beliefs, or a combination of both?
Thank you for that question. I think it was quite explored in the discussion that we just saw. But I was watching or listening to a panel that you facilitated, Mark. I think it was for the Other Foundation. And one of the panelists, Fikile Vilakazi, said something that just stuck with me since last I watched that, which is, Homophobia is an invasion, system of oppression that was imposed of a people who were living freely. We have always practiced who we are, inclusive of sexuality and gender diversity. And what has been imposed on us is hatred of difference. And I mean, that panel was discussing religion and spirituality and that with sexuality and gender diversity. But I think that it really speaks to how there's this space in connection to our past and to our present, which is filled with so much colonization, what the missionaries brought here, religion, organized religion, the violence that comes with religion, how religion is, I guess, used as a tool for political manipulation and isolation and exclusion, all of those things. And everything is connected in one way or another. And I think that's important to remember. I think that us, as queer people, as queer active people in today, us trying to connect to our past is something that allows us to look beyond what was brought to us. And yeah, I think I want that to be my response to that question.
I agree with so much that you've said, Nickita. I suppose what I'd like to add to that in a somewhat nuanced way, and it's in fact what I said in that panel discussion that you mentioned with Fikile Vilakazi is that one must be cautious nonetheless of what some writers and activists whom I respect, African writers and activists whom I respect, call Afro-Romanticism. This idea that that this continent was like a Garden of Eden, polyamorous, polysexual Garden of Eden before the colonizer came along. And the reason why I say that is because is not because I want to let the colonizer off the hook, not at all, but because I think it's really important for us to understand how deep-rooted in all our societies patriarchy is, and how the root of homophobia and transphobia is patriarchy, is a system of power where men rule by dominating women. And that system of power exists across time and across place. And that's what we need to challenge when we find it. I think that homosexuality is particularly threatening to the patriarchy, because if a man can lie with a man or a woman can lie with a woman, that makes sort of men, and it gets rid of the power structure between men and women, right? It means that relations don't have a dominant male and a submissive female, or even more threatening, that a male is choosing to be submissive, which is incredibly threatening to patriarchal males, or that a woman is being dominant, which is also threatening to patriarchal males. And I do believe that those systems, well, I don't believe, it's a fact that those systems were around in Africa, and therefore the work needs to be done in terms of traditional mores as well as in terms of within churches and Christianity or Islam. But I think what Nickita is saying that's so powerful and so valuable, and we explored this in our discussion beforehand, is the recourse that people can have and the power of that recourse to those traditional mores and values and systems that were egalitarian, that were open, or that remain open and egalitarian as a counter to patriarchy.
And I think, Xeenarh, would you like to have the last word on this before we close the panel discussion? I think I could see you there.
I was mostly agreeing with what Mark and Nickita had already said, but I also wanted to remind us that although it's easy to point fingers at Christianity, let's not forget that Islam is just as homophobic and just as problematic. As a Muslim woman who grew up being queer, I've seen that firsthand. And it's also good to remember that Africa is not a place that is also big on diversity and difference. We're very afraid of people who are different from us, and we try to understand that things that are different are usually scary and threatening. So homosexuality has just been one of those things that people have not understood for a very long time and has come with fear, even though that has been exacerbated by organized religion. And I think it's really great if we're able to look back at things of how it wasn't ideal in the past, but we can work to fix those differences and those fears, and to see that really diversity can be part of our strength and that everybody can live to the best of their ability without threatening others.
Great. Well, I'm just now going to invite Mark to tell everybody how they can get hold of a copy of The Pink Line, The World's Queer Frontiers. Over to you, Mark.
Well, firstly, thank you so much, Janet, for hosting this. And thank you, Nickita and Xeenarh and Kevin. I hope you're listening for the really fantastic conversation. And wow, how incredible to be on a webinar where there's input from people from Fiji to Guyana to Peterborough. I mean, it's a real thrill. I mean, this is the kind of global possibility that is so exciting, and that has been kind of perhaps opened up by this weird pandemic-y lockdown time we're in. So more of that, please. My book, speaking about digital and availability, books are physical things that don't move very quickly. If you are in the United Kingdom, in India, in Nigeria, in South Africa, in Australia and New Zealand, you can quite easily get a hard copy book from the publisher. Just Google it, or from one of the websites that sells books. I do not like to say the name of that horrible company on which we all depend, beginning with an A. If you are in Nigeria, I know that Roving Heights Bookshop has a lot of stock. If you want to buy the ebook, it is available as well. You'll find it online very easily. If you can't find it, or if you're in a place where it's not available, please contact me. And you can contact me through my website, which is www.markgevisser.com. And I'd be grateful if the folks at Commonwealth Writers can share that, www.markgevisser.com. I am also able to make arrangements with my publishers to get books at a discount for groups and organizations in the different territories. So if that's something that interests you, or if it interests you to have another dialogue with me and possibly with Nickita and Xeenarh and Kevin too, please be in touch with me through my website. And the purpose of this book is to get people talking. So I really am so happy to continue doing that, and to continue responding to your questions via my website too, if you have any that weren't answered here. Thank you again.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark. And we will do that. And also we posted your Twitter feeds, all of you, in the chat earlier on. So hopefully people will be getting in touch. So it leaves me to say that we'd like to invite you to our next episode in the Commonwealth Foundation's Critical Conversation series of online events, The Right to Health, which will take place on the 22nd of April. Additionally, the Commonwealth People's Forum is taking place during the week commencing the 21st of June 2021. The programme will involve a whole range of events on issues that really matter to the Commonwealth's 2.4 billion citizens. You can stay informed via the Foundation's mailing list, and you can sign up by going to our website, and at the bottom of each page, there's a sign up bar that you can all go to. So it just leaves me to say one more time, thank you all so much for your time, for the wonderful conversation. Thank you to all you out there who have taken the time to tune in, to switch from Facebook to Zoom, to come with us on this journey and to ask your wonderful questions. So thank you all, and goodbye.